Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm Joe Waters. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Capita, and we are delighted that you are here for this conversation with our first ever Capita Air Serenbe Journalism Fellows, Cinelle Barnes and Keren Landman. Capita, for those of you who do not know, Capita is a nonprofit ideas lab working at the intersection of research, policy, social innovation, design, and the arts to build a future in which all young children and their families flourish. And we partnered with Air Serenbe to host this residency because we believe that in this particular time and in the media landscape, it's really important to support both financially and with time and space those who are writing the stories of our children's futures, those who are writing stories about the most pressing issues facing our children and young families. And those are, of course, journalists. And so we're delighted to have been able to sponsor this and to host these two excellent journalists for some residency time. Keren actually is joining us from her residency at Serenbe. And so I'm just faking it with my background. Those are the rural studio cottages where the artists and journalists stay when they're in residence at Air Serenbe. And Cinelle, where are you joining us from today?
From Charleston, South Carolina.
So this is a conversation. I have invited them not only to answer my questions, but also to answer your questions. You can put those in the chat either on YouTube or through Zoom. And they're going to ask me questions as well. But I'm going to start today by asking them to tell us a little bit about themselves so that you can hear directly from them about who they are. Cinelle, how about you go first?
Hi, everyone. Joe, thank you for having me, and thank you for the privilege of being able to do research and set aside time and space to do the kind of research that I needed to do for this project. A little bit about me. I'm Cinelle Barnes. I'm a memoirist, essayist, and editor and educator, mostly narrative nonfiction work, book length, and some published essays as well in various publications. My first book was a memoir about my upbringing in the Philippines. And my second book was a collection of essays about being an undocumented immigrant and transnational adoptee and a young mother in the South. And I recently also edited an anthology of essays by 21 writers of color on the American South. And this project that I worked on that Capita and Serenbe, Air Serenbe have supported are kind of concentric with all those previous projects, and that they go back to this lifelong discovery of mine of what it means to heal from difficult experiences and how to help the world heal from its difficult realities. And so you'll learn more about it in a little bit, but that's me.
Great, thank you. Keren, how about you?
Yeah, so first, thanks. I'm delighted to be here and both at Serenbe and also in this virtual space. So thanks so much for putting this together, Joe. And also great to hear what Cinelle has been up to. We come from different places, but I think care about a lot of the same things. So I am a physician and an epidemiologist, as well as journalist now for about 5 years. My specialty is in medicine. I started out training in internal medicine and pediatrics, and then specialized in adult infectious diseases. Then went on to work in the malaria branch at CDC as a field epidemiologist in training, and then at the New York City Health Department before I pivoted to journalism. And for the last 5 years, I've combined work as a freelance journalist with work as a pediatrician. There's a little bit of crosstalk between both of areas in which I work. The journalism that I'm most passionate about creating all focuses on health disparities. So differences in the way different people have access to and benefit from or don't our healthcare system, and also healthcare systems outside the US. I have a pretty broad range of interests and what that can look like, whether it's care for infectious diseases like HIV, or HIV prevention, or risk for violence and trauma. So there are a lot of different ways in which circumstances, things that we now call social determinants of health, things that are really unrelated to the actual healthcare itself, but really to everything that happens between the patient and trying to get the healthcare. And those, I'm really interested in how those things impact the health of and healthcare access of people, and especially children, because eventually all children grow up to be adults, and the world that we want to see is one that we can begin building now by investing in the health and well-being of children. So something that just seems to come up in almost every conversation I have with folks about child health during this pandemic is the digital divide, and the way that differences in access to broadband internet affect everything in a child's life these days. It's not just about whether they can see school happening and get their schoolwork done. It goes well beyond that, and the inputs into whether children have access to broadband in the home are really overlap quite a bit with the factors that influence whether they have access to healthcare, clean water, healthy food, safe spaces to play, and all sorts of other things that really add up to opportunity. So there seems to be a lot of opportunity to learn and explain about how access or differences in access to broadband can both teach us how to do better in those other areas, and also is something itself worth focusing on in order to improve or reduce, I suppose, the impact of the disparities that's already been widened by this pandemic going forward. So that is what I've been focusing on for the most part here at JRNP.
Great. I'll be eager to hear more about that. Cinelle, why don't you tell us about your project? You were in residence last month, correct?
Correct. And I have proof of what I did. But I am a big cataloger, and I basically filled out about 200 of these index cards of annotated and cited sources for my research work, which is mostly about the global water crisis. And the kind of research I was doing really supports the narrative part and the lyrical part of this book length work, which is, in large part about my having grown up without access to safe water, to safe drinking water in the Philippines. And what many didn't realize, or many forget about me, is that I collected water growing up from the ages of 8 or 9 through 12. Walked miles to this public pump where the water was obviously untreated and was a stone's throw away from an imbornal, which is a canal basically that is an inlet of water that likely has passed through a garbage dump. And many times fell ill from drinking this water and had to learn from people along the way, including healthcare practitioners, that I had to boil the water, filter the water, boil the water, put a safe lid on the water to keep it safe from recontamination and all that. And so that definitely is a very personal matter to me. And of course, as a human being, I tried to avoid writing about the matter for 20 years. So it was about actually more than 20 years now that I last had to do that, and was last under the threat of waterborne and water-related diseases. And not to mention the gender gap that is associated with the responsibility of collecting water and treating it and boiling it. Tried to avoid all that and tried to jump into the matter, dance around it by researching and writing journalistically about it, and writing and editing for a global NGO that's based out of South Carolina and has offices in 10 countries in the world. And so my way of kind of addressing the issue and giving back now that I'm here in Charleston and with my own family and with a livelihood was to report on it. And during my time at CRMP, I realized I really could not run away from it and strictly write about it. Journalistically, at the same time, I couldn't just also get away from it and write about it strictly lyrically, because both would be kind of an evasion of the heart of the matter and really the solutions that I'm trying to present and trying to discover along the way. And so my time there was really just that thick wad of index cards and trying to figure out how to craft them together and make sure that they're all that the big T truth is relatable to my small t truth, and that the particularity of my story will speak to the universality of this very urgent crisis that's not just out there in developing countries, and not just in the global South, but very much here in the United States as well.
So as I see it, there are at least 3 different dimensions to any sort of water crisis. There's safe water, there's not enough water, there's too much water, right? And living in Charleston, you know that there are occasionally times when there's too much water, right? And we're dealing with the confluence of sort of whatever drives access to safe water with climate change, which is driving too little water, too much water. So can you just talk about how you're teasing at least those 3 dimensions of any water crisis out in your work?
Yeah, so I am trying to make it central to the experiences of mothers and daughters who represent about 95% of the world's population that is responsible for collecting water and treating it, and also in the end suffering from it. Everywhere, when you talk about healthcare, and there are places in the world where women have to bring their own clean water to clinics and healthcare facilities so that they could give birth, and they would be turned away if they don't have a gallon of water with them, and in turn have to give birth on their own at home in an unsanitary manner, and obviously without access to proper healthcare and medical assistance. And at the same time, so the problem is very woman and girl centric, and just 2 days ago we celebrated International Day of the Girl, and that's very much top of mind for me. And on the other hand, you have the problem that's so women and girl centric. The solution is also women and girl centric, in that because women are tasked with all these duties and the responsibility and the burden of ensuring life, ensuring water, they know the most about how to solve the problem locally, because like you said, there's a confluence of many factors, and every locale will have a different type of problem and a different kind of nuance to the problem. So these that are most exposed to the dangers that come with the water crisis, including animal attacks or being exposed to sexual predation on their way to a well. Like those things, they know which route to take. They know how many steps to take to get to this well. They know how heavy these buckets are. They know how much they need to ration throughout the day and the week, so that they don't have to miss school or miss farming. And so that's really kind of like the 2 parameters, the parenthetical parameters I'm setting for myself. And of course, the story will tell itself along the way with the reporting and the writing. But again, I keep trying to run away from the story, and it keeps pivoting back to my own life. And the impetus really for all of this was, in the first chapter that I've written was a simple conversation with my own daughter, who's 8. And, I was writing a story about these girls in Indonesia, and she's reading over my shoulder, and it was a story about these girls about the same age as her, and they look just like me and look just like her. And coming from Southeast Asia, and she's like, "Mom, what are they doing?" So I was going through these like photos and source material, and I said, "Oh, they're collecting water. They have to walk up this ravine, barefoot, because it's the safest way, instead of like climbing a mountain in flip-flops." Climbing that mountain, is like, yeah, they have to do that every day. They have to go up this mountain, get the water from this waterfall, and then come back down. And if it's Southeast Asia, so it's always raining and it's slippery and there's jagged rock. And if they fall, they have to go back up again, because guess what? They're responsible for that water. And if they don't collect it and collect enough of it, they could get in trouble, and they could get in trouble with their family or their community, or they might miss school for the rest of the day. And she, in that conversation, decided she was going to have a lemonade stand and raise money. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, this is the power of like what Keren and I do, is that people are inherently good. Like, people want to help. People as young as 8 years old want to do things for other children in the world. And it's just that no one knows. Very few people know, and it's almost a privilege to know. And the thing about just like the nature of water itself is that unless you contain it, it's just going to keep ebbing and flowing, right? And the more of us know, the more of us can do something about it. So.
Great, thank you. Keren, I want to hear more about your project. You focused on the digital divide, but if I remember correctly, you were focused on that in a particular place in Georgia, an experience in Georgia.
Yeah, right. So first, Cinelle, I'm so glad that you are listening to the part of you that wants to tell this as your own story, because it sounds like it is such a powerful way to approach this, and you'll generate all the right questions because you've had to answer them yourselves. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you make. So I had been reporting some pieces for the Macon Telegraph as part of a project with the Center for Sustainable Journalism at Kennesaw State University near Atlanta. And the projects were all related to gun violence. And so I was talking to folks in Macon about what put kids at risk for gun violence to begin with, what kinds of solutions might work. The folks I talked to a lot of folks in electeds, even in law enforcement. I talked to the DA, I talked to school superintendents, and then I talked to a lot of folks in the communities where the kids at highest risk for childhood trauma live. Most of those are poor communities. Many of them are majority Black communities. All have pretty low resources educationally, and in many other ways have a lot of community strengths, but among they do a lot with very little, and that very little is often, investments in community safety, and investments in developing access to good food and good water. So I was asking questions about what put kids at risk for violence, and all of them, almost everybody I spoke with, brought up the problems with broadband access. And part of that is that what drives kids being safely at home and being productively at home, especially during the pandemic, has been what they can get and do on the internet. And it's school, certainly, but it's also the quality of school. Are they having an engaging class on the internet, or are they just kind of class being supervised while they do some kind of work at home? Are their parents able to access information about not just about school, but about access to emergency meal services and changes in transportation for the parent work? Or do they miss out on that information, deprives their families of good food and deprives often the parents of access to employment opportunities? So it seemed like this one thing, access to broadband, that so many of us just kind of take for granted, really was an upstream cause of a lot of big downstream problems, well beyond just access to educational opportunities. That said, access to educational opportunities is itself a really big deal. There are already dramatic disparities in opportunity and attainment between high and lower income communities throughout Georgia, and including those smaller communities within Macon and Bibb County. And Black and Brown communities have also lower rates of educational opportunities and lower levels of access to broadband, lower rates of device ownership, and so also compounded with the problems that come from being disproportionately lower income, this additional layer of decreased access to opportunity. So I have been in contact with folks at a Head Start project in Bibb County, which is there's sort of one, I'm probably gonna use the wrong terminology here, but there is one entire public housing project that has its own Head Start office and program. And it is through that office that I have been in the process of getting connected with a family that is working through some of these challenges and trying to use some of the resources that the school district and the state have been making available to areas of the state that are at higher risk for broadband access difficulties. So, you know, the county and the district have rolled out some really interesting solutions. And one of the things that I'm interested in is understanding how well those solutions work and where the problems are. One of the most innovative sounding solutions is these ranger buses. They're school buses equipped with these massive Wi-Fi hotspots, and they drive into neighborhoods and, you know, park there for a large chunk of the day so that kids pull up with their computers and access the internet that way. You know, there's some obvious good things that could come from a project like that, but then some obvious concerns, you know, that places where it might not work, some weather issues that may interfere with it working. You know, and if the neighborhood, if it's unsafe to walk from your house to where the ranger bus is, what do you do then? What works for you if that doesn't work? There are also issues with, you know, it's not just whether the student has access to broadband, it's whether their teachers have access to broadband, and whether their teachers have access to the professional development that they need in order to change the way they teach. I mean, anybody who has a kid who has gone from in-person school to internet school knows that some teachers have made that adjustment smoother than others. And, you know, in communities where there is less professional development for teachers, even for many of those teachers, they're in the same income bracket as their students. And so they also don't have great internet access at home. So all of this compounds to often create a much less enriching online school environment for a student, even if they can access the internet. There are a lot of folks trying to solve these problems, and I'm really interested in seeing through the lens of folks in this one community in Macon, you know, whether those solutions are working or not.
So Keren, thank you for that overview. At a high level, I'm really interested in, first of all, why do certain communities not have access to broadband or you know, for example, as others? But secondly, and perhaps this is maybe even the more exciting question, right? Solutions like the buses, good solutions, but to me those seem like temporary stopgaps, right? That the real,
Right.
the real sort of approach that we need is, massive investment, whether it's from the private sector or the public sector, to make sure that people have the infrastructure that others of us take for granted, right? So beyond those solutions, what's your idea for the big systemic solution to this problem?
Well, it is not my idea, but it is something that is in a hot topic of discussion and of legislation in Georgia right now, and actually in the last session. So in the broad brush painting of the picture is that internet is, it's not profitable to extend internet into certain communities because of what it costs for the internet company to actually attach the lines to the poles. In places where, for example, Georgia Power runs the poles, it can cost a few dollars for the internet company to attach the line to the pole. But in communities, many of them rural, I think something like 90% of rural communities are actually served by these electricity co-ops. And those co-ops charge a much higher price, something like $20 a pole, for the internet company to attach their cable to that pole. So what that means is it just costs a lot more for companies to pin their attach their cables to that pole, and
which is why there are
resistant.
rural electric co-ops, anyways, right? Because the same thing was happening with electricity in the 1930s.
Right. So there is a bill was just passed in the last session of the Georgia State Legislature to reshuffle the deck, basically, and try to align the incentives a little bit differently. Understanding the details of that is part of what I'm doing here. So, and really what the practicalities are of that change happening. Now, I don't know actually if that is what's keeping folks in urban places, and Macon would be considered an urban place in this scenario, from accessing internet. So there's a difference between not even having the service available in your area, which I think is the case in many rural places in Georgia, and just not being able to afford the service that is available in your area, or being able to afford the high level of service that you need in your area versus the lower level. So, Cox Cable's cable company and a couple other cable companies have a special program for low-income families where they can access internet for something like $10 a month. But it's not as straightforward as it sounds. First of all, it's not always high-speed internet, and you often need high-speed internet to do the things that kids need to do for educational purposes. The second thing is, and this is something that I'm working to understand better, but I'm hearing from folks that if you have ever had a past due bill with one of these companies, you cannot take advantage of these services. And a lot of low-income families sometimes don't pay the bills, and it's as do lots of high-income families too. I mean, this is not, they certainly do not have the monopoly on that. So that makes that service unavailable to some families, and even when it is available, inadequate for a lot of families. So there's sort of different problems in different spaces, but I think a lot of people are hoping that changing the way these electricity co-ops charge and that align the incentives for them such that they're really able to expand into rural areas and increase the availability of these services. That seems like a first step for a lot of people living in rural areas of Georgia for reducing some of the educational disparity there. And then I know you'd asked about a second question, and I don't remember what that was or if I answered it.
Which is why, and I think you touched on it. Why is there not access, certainly for these folks, and what is the solution? So I think you got both of them.
Yeah, I think so.
Great. Cinelle, I want to ask you a little bit about the residency experience itself. I love talking to our Air Serenbe alums to hear how that went, because it's an unusual gift of time and space that people have. It's a beautiful location. We invite you to come there, and if you want to twiddle your thumbs for a week or two or three, that's fine. If you want to create the next Nobel Prize winning project, you can do that too. We haven't done that yet, just for the record, but I'm curious how it was for you. What did you learn maybe about yourself and your work that you might not have seen or understood in your usual writing place?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I think one of the main things that it benefited my work is that it afforded me time and space to sleep. I probably woke up later in the span of 2 weeks, than I have in 8 years. And so I think that just energized me to get more reading done, get more cataloging done. I took daily walks, actually twice a day, every morning upon waking up, and then at dusk. And Serenity is so beautiful, and there are trails everywhere, and you can get lost without getting lost, and also happen upon, whether it's a teepee in the woods or, a waterfall in the woods. So it pretty much, I think, allowed me to also inhabit the space that I live in memory. That's related to the project. And it also allowed me to live in the space that I hope I get to be in physically soon when travel restrictions are lifted for, international research travel. But definitely it was those two things that were very restorative and generative as well. I also really love meeting the residents, the locals. I remember there was actually a quick power outage one night, and it was about to get dark, and so I went into town. That's how I say it to my husband. I went into town and literally walked up to random people, at a safe distance and masked up, and borrowed power banks and things like that, and made friends very easily. And they were genuinely interested in why I was there, what I was doing, what I was reporting on and researching. And, they asked all the best questions that I felt like made my work deeper, and that my thought process went deeper. And, it was almost like giving another elevator pitch for the project. This time with people that stand in for that end reader, basically, and that already have somewhat of a relationship with, actually a great relationship with nature and with social justice reform, and with enabling and empowering women and children. And so it made it a really conducive space for the kind of writing and researching I was trying to do.
Keren, before I bring that question to you, I want to invite anyone who is joining us today to submit your questions, your comments for these two writers in the chat or using the Q&A box. Want to hear from you before we conclude our time together today. So please send those questions in. Keren, same question for you about the residency experience itself while you're still in it, granted.
Yeah, you're seeing it. I think, working outside is something that I don't think, I mean, the place where I live now is just really not conducive to that for a variety of reasons that I don't need to get into, but here it really is. There are a few spaces around the house where you can very easily plop down with a laptop or a book and get a lot done very comfortably. And I find that a really nourishing physical space to work. So that's something that I have really cherished here. And those walks in the woods really, I think, probably are the high point for me too, Cinelle. That a lot of the big thinking and the deep thinking around ideas and the kind of the linkages that you don't really make when you're just staring at a page, a lot of that happens when your brain has a chance to breathe. And behind the house here in particular, there's a network of trails that really feels like it goes on forever, but you're right, Cinelle, you get lost without getting lost. And that sort of sense of wandering, and it is really just so beautiful back there that I've made a daily habit of going for a walk in that on those trails because it does seem to be kind of where my brain wants to be before it comes up with any good big ideas. So, this project has been great and interesting, but it's not the only project I'm working on here. There are also a couple of other big things that I'm tying up and wrapping up while I'm here, and that those walks have really been key for getting some of the last big ideas out and eventually onto a page. So that has been a real treasure. I also, there's another resident in the house next door who just kind of joined a few days ago, and he's great. He's a delight. He's with I think the air the art farm section of the residency. So he's not a Capita Fellow, but he's a food writer and critic, and is it's been so nice to just make new friends with a creative and delightful new person. I, as well as the folks who hosted us for dinner one night in Serenbe, and all the people that we've run into while walking the dog or just wandering around. The people are friendly. Nobody really seems to be in a rush. People are happy to just sit and talk or stand and talk. And it has been a really nourishing experience to just have contact with people outside of my routine who are really committed to a peaceful existence and a creative existence. That's been really fun.
Great, thank you. And I will note that somebody just popped into the Q&A that they are listening to this webinar from the woods at Serenbe.
That's him.
So wonderful. Again, please send in any questions that you have, or use the Q&A or the chat. Keren, I want to ask you about this particular big part of your biography, which is that you're a physician and a journalist. And I'm just curious to ask you, how do those two things work together? And are you still practicing? Do you see patients?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last question first. So since COVID, the clinic where I had been working has been seeing a much lower volume. I think part of it is that people were for a long time scared to get healthcare, and also for a long time kids were not really going to school or having much contact with other kids, so they weren't getting the kinds of things that usually bring them into the sorts of clinics where I was working. So me as a part-timer, I have not actually been in that clinic for some months now. But that is, I believe, a temporary pause, and I will be back to clinical practice in some form within, I hope, a few months. So, I always wanted to write. I always liked writing, and I never really took it seriously as a career choice. I also really I got a lot of meaning out of caring for people. I have a brother with special needs, and I think I kind of grew up being a nurturer, and I get a lot of meaning out of that kind of work. And in various sort of professions that I inhabited before going to medical school, those kinds of things really confirm that. So, the choice to get a degree in medicine and go on and do all the work and specializing was driven mostly by that. But there was always still this thirst for self-expression, and I tried all kinds of ways to get my voice out while I was in training and afterward, and eventually realized that I was not going to stop doing that, and I would not feel good about myself and about my life's work if I didn't take that drive seriously and try to somehow combine these two things in my professional life. So, it's hard to have multiple passions, but I'm trying to honor all of them in my own way.
Wonderful. And I will note too that I know that you were not the first physician to do a residency at Air Serenbe either.
Really?
We had a poet a few years ago, Charles Bards, who's a professor at Weill Cornell, and a wonderful poet. And he had just completed a book-length poem on the death of his father, and gave a wonderful talk in the Oak Room at the Inn at Serenbe. So you might want to look up his name, Charles Bards. And for those of you, it's been a few who are Air Serenbe followers. That's been a few years, but that was a great guest that we had. Cinelle, as we start to look towards the end of our time together, what is one project that you've dreamed about but haven't started yet?
There are actually two novels that I just keep thinking about all the time. I think about the characters in these novels when I'm watching a movie or when I'm walking through downtown Charleston or at the beach. But one of them is set in New York City at an immigration detention center, and really plays out three identities that I feel like I identify with. So maybe I'm a composite character of all three of these characters, but have the safety of my imagination. The second one is set in Charleston, and it keeps rewriting itself in my head, and also keeps manifesting more right now, at least, as illustrations of flowers that are representative of, I think, the main characters in the story. And it also has something to do with climate speed and our city sinking, and at the same time, the art world, the local art world, and crime in a very Charleston fashionable way.
Well, I'm just curious. There are a lot of Charleston writers. Does it matter that you are a Charleston writer? Do you identify yourself that way? And what role, if any, does the Charleston landscape, but also the long literary tradition in Charleston play in your work?
Yeah, I think, the anthology I just edited that I compiled together called A Measure of Belonging, that came out of an experience here in Charleston, and it was 10 years in the making in my head, and 2 years on the computer. But that was born out of an experience here in Charleston. And really the whole premise is that at the time I was not representative of who you would call a Charlestonian. And now that I've lived here for nearly a decade, I claim my stake. I birthed a child here in the water, of all places here. And raising a child here and definitely forming an identity and a home here and interacting with many facets of life, and also kind of acting as a cross-pollinator almost between neighborhoods and groups of people and subcultures and ways of thinking that probably wouldn't normally interact or engage with one another. And so in that sense, as a nonfiction writer, I definitely consider myself as a Charleston writer, maybe a new Charleston writer, I don't know, but I think it was necessary, and as much as I can, I try to hold the door open for other writers here, other journalists here, other poets here, that they themselves would probably hesitate to call themselves Charleston writers or Southern writers, or their understanding even of what type of writer they are is nebulous. I think if making your stake in a place is about making making a space within a space. And I think I'm one of those.
Keren, what's a project that you've dreamed about but haven't started yet?
Gosh, fiction. I mean, I used to do a lot of creative writing, and I haven't in a really long time. And although I love the work that I do, it often doesn't feel, it's not creative. It's, it's fact based. And I have a speculative fiction work of some sort rattling around in my brain. It's really just an idea, and I don't know how or when I would write something like this, but it's been bothering me long enough that I think I'm going to have to do it eventually. So yeah, I think that would probably be my unbirthed idea.
Karen, I think the word you used was perfect. You said it's been bothering me. I think that's really what all this is.
Right. They're just ideas that tickle your brain, and you just keep swatting them away. And if they don't go away, then you have to find a way to get them out. So someday, maybe.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your time today, particularly Keren, in the middle of your residency. We're grateful that you've taken the time to be with us. And Cinelle from home, thank you for reconnecting with the residency experience a month or so on from it. And thank you and congratulations too on being the inaugural recipients of this particular fellowship. We're eager to see what comes out of it in the months and years ahead, and continuing to read and to follow your work. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you
So many
much.
thanks to you. Sorry, Cinelle.
And thank you all for joining us today. Those of you who tuned in, this will be available on Capita's YouTube page. So if you want to share it with your friends and others who might have missed this particular time live and in person, so to speak, you'll be able to do that. But thank you very much for your support of Capita, for your support of Air Serenbe, and for caring deeply about creating time and space for some of the world's most interesting artists to do good work. And with that, have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.